It's been 16 years since the tragic terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, an event believed to have radically reshaped relations between the U.S. and the rest of the world. Just overnight, an unexpected war on terror became the highest priority of the U.S., upending the traditional set of interests that governed its bilateral relations with other countries. As Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Somalia and Yemen have descended into chaos nowadays, it seems the war is far from being won. Will we ever win this war? Are we addressing the root causes of terrorism or merely treating the symptoms? How can we fight terrorism more effectively? I'm pleased to be joined by Ambassador Daniel Benjamin in London. He's a long-time practitioner in the field of counter-terrorism. He was former Ambassador at Large and coordinator for counter-terrorism at the U.S. State Department from 2009 to 2012 under President Obama, where he coordinated U.S. government efforts to fight terrorism. He also served as a foreign policy speechwriter and special assistant to President Bill Clinton and as director for transnational threats. Ambassador Benjamin, thank you very much for joining us today. Now, you worked under both the Clinton and Obama administrations. How is President Trump's anti-terrorism plan different from his predecessors?
Well, in practical terms, in operational terms, it's very much the same as President Obama's. There are a lot more continuity than change right now, despite the fact that President Trump campaigned on a platform of a radically new approach to counterterrorism. He didn't give many details. It wasn't a very specific pledge that he made. But right now, you know, the military is essentially doing the same sort of thing it did under President Obama, using a lot of intelligence to conduct highly targeted raids. Our intelligence operations and our law enforcement operations are also continuing along the same lines. What has changed is a lot of the rhetoric, and the president's habit of tweeting, for example, has not helped. But to date, you know, we haven't seen any of the big changes that he promised during the campaign. We haven't seen the reinstitution of torture, for example, of targeting terrorists' families, of really taking the gloves off and using vastly more firepower than had been used before. So in that sense, there's been a lot of continuity. There are some other aspects of his approach that are different and that will show you know, their results further down the line, but in terms of operations, it's very much the same.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that President Trump has been kind of known for so far is his unpredictability, besides the tweeting habit that he seems to be continuing demonstrating. How do you think this unpredictability has affected or has been translated into the work of counterterrorism?
Well, very little, in fact. Counterterrorism, first of all, it doesn't really allow for unpredictability in the same way. But what we have seen is some pretty dramatic steps that the president has taken that, while not exactly unpredictable, will have effects down the line. So, for example, his embrace of the Saudi government, which has been in taking, you know, we have a good relationship with Saudi Arabia. We've had it for a long time, but he has taken the Saudi side in the sort of regional conflict between Sunni and Shia Muslims in a way that could actually increase the amount of violence over the long term, because this sectarian strife is a major driver of sectarian, jihadist terrorism. That's one area. The other area is with the very sharp rhetoric towards Pakistan. That also could have consequences down the line, because as one president after another has found, it's very hard to get Pakistan to do all that you want it to do, but it's also very hard to do counterterrorism without a good relationship with Pakistan, or at least a working relationship.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's talk about President Trump's Afghanistan policy. While as a candidate, he denounced Afghanistan as a total disaster, and now President Trump said he will ramp up U.S. engagement in Afghanistan and handily defeat terrorism there. His speech on Afghanistan troop deployment is in lockstep with the past presidents, and for people who hope that President Trump would be a transformative president in fighting terrorism, what has he achieved so far, and how do you look at his Afghanistan policy?
Well, let me answer what I think are two parts of the question. The Afghanistan policy is another example of continuity with the past policies. In fact, it's rather ambiguous in many of its details. He has been very explicit in saying that he wanted to withdraw from Afghanistan, but at the end of the day, he was prepared to be influenced by the military leadership surrounding him. I think that's probably a good thing, because I think that there are lots of good developments in Afghanistan that we should not squander by a hasty departure. At the same time, this is not a solution. This is not a recipe for winning the war over the Taliban. I don't think that is really a winnable war, certainly not on the current trajectory, but what it will do is continue to give the government there and the military there some breathing space to strengthen and we hope embrace policies that will earn the loyalty of more of the population. You spoke about people who expected transformative effects in counterterrorism. I think many of those people were people who are animated, that is, we're talking about American voters, people who are animated by strong anti-Muslim sentiment, and they certainly will be disappointed that he hasn't embraced any of the really somewhat outlandish proposals he made during the campaign. Personally, I think that that's a good thing. A return to torture would result in international condemnation in the United States and would only accelerate the drivers of terrorism. It would only increase, I think, recruitment. It would be bad for our moral character. It would be bad for our policies. I think that the president has, in a sense, maintained the same kind of wary to negative posture towards Muslims in the United States. He has not stood up, for example, when people were wondering how he would react to an attack on a bus in the Pacific Northwest, where a right-wing radical was hectoring some girls, was really screaming at some girls, claiming that they were Muslim and that they were to blame for all the country's problems. And 2 Americans were killed defending them, and that is something that he never really took note of. And there have been many attacks against mosques and against Muslims in the United States, and he's been notably silent on that. So in that regard, he continues to try to curry favor with his base, but in terms of doing the big transitions, the big turns, the new policies that so many had feared, they haven't really appeared yet.
Well, talking about that, how do you look at the potential effect of him being quiet about this kind of anti-Muslim behavior in that country? Basically, he is allowing this kind of hatred to exist, right? Even, for instance, the kind of travel ban that he famously defends as not being a Muslim ban. How do you think will be the consequences of this kind of measures in terms of counterterrorism?
Over the long term, these are very negative developments. The key, or one of the keys, to counterterrorism success for the United States at home has been the cooperation of the American Muslim community, or communities as it's often called because it's so diverse. That relies on the trust that Muslims living in the United States have that their government is there to protect them, work with them, and promote their best interests, and not target them in any way. And there's great fear in many different corners, in the law enforcement community, and certainly among those who watch this carefully, that trust is being eroded. the fact that the president hasn't spoken up when Muslims have been the target of violent crimes is very, very disturbing. The travel ban that you mentioned has been enormously disturbing and is totally and utterly counterproductive. Virtually the entire United States counterterrorism community that is in a position to say anything about this travel ban, that is to say is not actually in government service right now, has come out against it because it is such a negative signal to Muslims at home, to Muslims abroad, to those that we work with through intelligence, with our military. This is really bad news and is going to hurt us over the long run.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the undesired effects, side effects of U.S.'s military operations in Afghanistan, for instance, and a part of that is collateral damage. In July, the UN revealed that in Afghanistan there have been 70% more civilian casualties from American airstrikes in the first months of 2017 than the same period of time last year. In Iraq and in Syria, also about half of all civilians killed by airstrikes since the war began in August 2014 have died under President Trump's watch. So as President Trump vows to lift restriction and expand authorities in the field, is he signaling that he is endorsing even more collateral damage to civilians?
It's a very interesting question that you raise. The Pentagon has repeatedly denied that the rules that it is operating under are different from those that were in place when President Obama was president. Now, it is possible that the operational tempo, that is the number of attacks, have increased so much that we have seen that rise in collateral damage. The collateral damage story is a really problematic one. First of all, it's terrible that innocents are being killed in counterterrorism operations. It's morally bad. It may at times be unavoidable, but you certainly want your government to avoid all such casualties because at the end of the day, the families and the friends and the loved ones of those who are killed, are easily swayed by radical narratives, mm-hmm. and it certainly feeds the larger discourse in those countries that the United States is ultimately hostile to Islam and hostile to Muslims. So it's very hard to get the balance right, but seeing those casualties go up is highly, highly problematic and will really, really hurt us in the long term. Now, I have to say that there's just no evidence that the president cares a great deal about this issue. I can tell you that President Obama cared deeply about it, and it was that desire, for example, that prompted him to have the United States publish lists of the numbers, at any rate, of casualties from counterterrorism operations, and to insist that both the military and intelligence communities work to minimize casualties. Mm-hmm. I think if you talk to any of the commanders who've worked in those areas, they will tell you that the collateral damage problem is one of the greatest ones we face in terms of winning the sympathies of the local populations and of being successful in our efforts.
Mm-hmm. I have been talking to Ambassador Daniel Benjamin from London. He was former ambassador at large and coordinator for counterterrorism at U.S. State Department from 2009 to 2012. We'll take a short break and we'll be back right after this. Yeah, Ambassador Benjamin, now according to the U.S. State Department, the number of foreign terrorist groups has grown from 28 in 2002 to 44 in 2009 and to 62 today. What trend does that change reflect? And are we winning this war on terror?
Big questions, and not necessarily the same question. So as a coordinator for counterterrorism, I oversaw the process that led to listing of foreign terrorist organizations. So part of the reason the number has gone up is because there are quite a lot of groups out there, and the State Department simply did not have the manpower to get them all listed instantly. It's not like suddenly we discover a new terrorist group and it immediately gets listed. A lot of these groups have been out there for a long time, and then they got added to the list as the staff at the State Department has worked through the different cases. These are highly labor-intensive processes, so it doesn't happen that quickly. Some of these groups are offspring of other groups, splinter groups, for example. But some of them also are new, and that is, of course, worrisome. ISIS was a new phenomenon, although it grew out of Al-Qaeda. And many groups associated with the rise of ISIS and the sudden infestation or the rapid infestation of Syria with lots of new terrorist groups can be pointed to as reasons for this. The larger question of whether we are winning or not in the war on terror is, I think, an important one and a complicated one. If you go back to late 2001 and early 2002, 2003, I think the consensus in the United States government, but also in many other governments, was that we were going to see many more genuinely catastrophic attacks. And by catastrophic, I mean attacks with death tolls in the 4 digits or more. That has not happened. The international alliance, coalition of people working against, countries working against terrorism has been extraordinarily effective in preventing, so far, the high-end attack, the attacks that might involve weapons of mass destruction, that might attack transportation in ways that would cause really huge numbers of deaths. So I think that that is a very positive development. If you are living in the United States, you have the feeling that you are losing in the war on terror. And certainly lots of politicians have exploited this, among them President Trump, this sense of vulnerability, and many of his followers believe that we are losing. But if you look at the statistics and you take a hard analytic look at the matter, in fact, I would submit that we're doing very, very well. Fewer than 100 people in the United States have been killed by extremists, by Islamist terror since 2001. And we have yet to verify a single case within the United States of a terrorist who was acting under the command and control of foreign organizations who came into the United States and killed Americans. So when you consider, you know, the big picture of a population of 320, 30 million and all the different causes of death that we encounter, this is minuscule. In fact, since 2001, the percentage of American deaths caused by terrorism, by jihadist terrorism, is, I believe, 1/200th of 1%. Mm-hmm. So it's very small, and I would say this is a sign of great success. It's also a sign, coming back to something we were talking about earlier, of the really effective cooperation between law enforcement and the American Muslim community. The story is a little different in Europe, yes, where you have...
Yes, go ahead.
Yes,
please.
Go on.
No, I wanted to mention Europe because although... Yeah, go ahead, please.
So the story is a little different in Europe, where the communities, Muslim communities, have a very different character. They tend to be much less educated, have much higher unemployment, be more alienated, and subject to more discrimination, actually. But even so, the numbers in Europe, despite such horrific attacks as the ones we saw in Paris and Brussels, and some of the vehicle attacks, suggest, you know, that overall the situation, while serious, is hardly existential. What's more, and this is true in the United States, it's true in Europe, the authorities have gotten very, very good at stopping plots. Our counterterrorism practices have gotten better and better. It is not reassuring that so many plots are out there, but they have been thwarted, most of them. So while people are, public opinion polls show a great deal of anxiety, in fact, the truth is it's not a catastrophic problem at the moment. Where the problem is really great is in a few countries. Those countries are Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Nigeria. And also, I would say Yemen probably belongs in there, too. Mm-hmm. That's where the worst violence is. And unfortunately, I don't see any likelihood that that violence is going to diminish anytime soon.
Yeah.
For all the reasons that we know that are driving division in those countries.
Let's talk a little bit about the region. First of all, we are hearing so much about one lone wolf attacks after another in Europe, but in the other parts of the world where you're talking about, Yemen, Pakistan, Libya, we don't actually hear so much, although the casualty, the scale of things is actually much higher. That is the sad fact we're seeing today. Secondly, let's talk a little bit of the root causes of why the situation is so bad in these countries. For instance, many observers say the reason why the IS came into being and, in a very short period of time got large control in the territory of Iraq was because of the vacuum that was left after Saddam Hussein was toppled as a result of the US's invasion in that country. And a similar situation in Libya when the Western coalition took out Muammar Gaddafi, the vacuum left in that country simply was not strong, and there was no forces that could contain Islamic fundamental groups such as the IS, and that is why we're also seeing this kind of flourishing of terrorist attacks in that country. How do you look at these?
Well, the invasion of Iraq was America's greatest strategic blunder in foreign affairs, probably in our history, and we will pay the price for that and for the upending of the kind of political and religious ecosystem in that part of the world for a long time to come. I don't think there's any question about that. What you are describing is the challenge we face in containing extremism in countries that are partially or wholly failed. And, where there is no government that enjoys a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, unfortunately, this is what you get. We see it as well in Yemen. We have seen it in Somalia, although I think things are getting better in Somalia. And unfortunately, there are no great solutions for these problems. And as a result, these places, these theaters, draw in people who have been mobilized, who have been radicalized, who have been the subject of propaganda campaigns by extremists, and who have decided that they want to be part of this historical struggle, as they view it, to create new and authentic Islamic entities, such as the Caliphate. I would add that they are successful, that is, these mobilizers, these recruiters, because of a broad array of root causes that are not going to go away anytime soon. And those causes can be, among them can be included misgovernance, repression, a lack of economic opportunity, a lack of political voice. These are the endemic problems of the Arab Middle East to a large extent, and they are not going to be solved by any act of the United Nations or any program of the United States and its partners overnight. These are long-term problems. The state system in the region is in tatters, the worst condition it's been in more than a century, and possibly even in history. So these are big, big historical forces, and it's very hard to see the extremism going away until that is sorted out. The economic inequalities are just staggering. The lack of opportunity for young men in particular, you know, it's a huge problem. And so this will continue to provide fuel for extremism for decades to come.
How do you look at the kind of double standards that we are seeing in different parts of the world when we talk about terrorism? And many people believe this is the factor that is preventing countries from better coordinating with each other so that counterterrorism operations can be more effective. What is your take on that?
First of all, I would say the counterterrorism coordination among most countries in the world is extremely good and far better than you might expect if you looked at the level of political relationships. So there are many countries that don't have very good political relationships, and yet when it comes to counterterrorism and they're in the intelligence sphere, they cooperate quite well because terrorism is seen as a threat to all. You know, as for double standards at the political level, there's a never-ending debate about definitions of terrorism, about whether so-called people's liberation movements should be counted as terrorists or not. I think the good news story is that governments on most of the big issues find ways to cooperate that don't get hung up on definitional matters, so that there is still a lot of effectiveness. At that higher level, you know, there are political considerations about whether or not you know, you're really an anti-colonial power in the developing world, or whether you're a Western power. All these issues have a lot of baggage. But you know, I think we found time and again that at least in terms of dealing with the terrorists who threaten us most, that most countries in the world still cooperate. And in fact, you talked about all the new foreign terrorist organizations, but what you didn't talk about is how much the list of state sponsors of terrorism has shrunk. And that, I think, is one of the important stories of this period. Iran sponsors terrorism. Syria is still counted as a sponsor of terrorism. But beyond that, you know, there really isn't a lot of activity out there to be noted.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Ambassador Daniel Benjamin, former Ambassador at Large and Coordinator for Counterterrorism at the United States State Department from 2009 to 2012. And that's it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, follow us on Twitter or Facebook using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN Live to watch our show live on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. I'm Liu Xin, and you've got the point.